Welcome to The Last Hike. Today's story is about a woman who treated restricted access not as a boundary, but as a problem to work around. Instead of stopping at the permit system designed to control entry, she restructured the hike around it, extending distance, exposure, and time in order to reach the same objective through an alternate route. By the time the canyon heat peaked, her plan no longer matched where she actually was. It was March 14, 2023 in Scottsdale, Arizona, when the idea of hiking Angel's Landing in Zion National Park first became a fixed plan tied to a specific summer trip. That evening, a screenshot of an Angel's Landing summit photograph was posted. Within hours, it drew multiple reactions, including a question about whether access had already been secured. Vienne Jemison was 51 years old. She lived in northeastern Scottsdale near the edge of a large desert preserve and worked in pharmaceutical sales, a field defined by persistence, composure under rejection, and long-term goal pursuit. She was an active recreational hiker with consistent experience on desert trails in Arizona and occasional trips to higher elevation terrain, reflected in her regular outdoor activity and documented hikes. It never really became a full hiking plan in the environmental sense. It narrowed early into a single objective, getting onto Angel's Landing, permit or not. Everything else, water, heat, turnaround decisions, stayed secondary to that. Access became the defining constraint she organized everything around. In January, February, and March, she entered the permit lottery multiple times and did not secure a date for her planned summer trip. Early responses to the results were restrained frustration, followed by continued attempts and informal advice seeking about better odds or alternative dates. By April, her framing had shifted. The permit system stopped being something she was working within and became something she was working around, reinforced by framing it as administrative rather than safety-driven. The focus shifted away from the hiking conditions behind the restriction and toward removing the restriction itself. I'm not going to overthink it, but she didn't get a permit. She didn't even get it after multiple tries. And at some point, you can kind of see the focus start shifting away from the trail itself and more toward finding a way around it. Her subsequent research shifted toward bypass logistics rather than trail conditions, enforcement timing, checkpoint locations, penalties for unauthorized access, and alternative approaches using the West Rim route from Lava Point. The evaluation framework moved from whether the hike was manageable under conditions to how it could be completed outside the permit system. What I really don't see here is how uneven the attention is between the system she was trying to get through and the actual conditions she was stepping into. Even with forecasts pointing to sustained triple-digit heat, that information never carried the same weight as the access problem. It stayed secondary in the planning. By the time she reached Zion, she had a detailed entry strategy, but a much less developed model of what that distance, elevation, and heat would actually combine into on the ground. The logistics were clear, the physical consequences were not fully internalized. She arrived in Springdale on the evening of June 15, a small gateway town positioned just outside the southern entrance to the canyon system and functioning almost entirely as the operational base for visitors entering the park. In peak season, the town operates less like a destination and more like a processing point, a place where hikers, tour groups, and independent travelers converge briefly before dispersing into the canyon at first light. The streets were active with early summer traffic, with gear shops, food stops, and shuttle pickup points moving at a steady but familiar rhythm shaped by seasonal demand. Her accommodation was located near the park entrance within walking distance of the shuttle system that serves the canyon corridor. She checked in without issue and appeared structured and composed in her preparation, treating the evening as part of a planned sequence rather than a point of decision. There was no visible hesitation in her movements or changes in intent. Outside, temperatures remained warm, but still within a manageable early summer range for the region, the kind of desert heat that experienced hikers often accept as baseline conditions rather than a limiting factor, especially during evening hours when the canyon temporarily cools before the next day's rise. There is not much focus, at least from what I could tell, on things like heat illness, how much water she'd realistically need, or when you're supposed to just turn around if it gets too much in exposed canyon terrain. She spent the evening handling routine preparations, organizing gear, reviewing timing, and orienting herself to the logistics of the following morning. The atmosphere in town reflected the broader season, visitors arriving late, others returning from completed hikes, and early risers preparing for departures before daylight. Nothing about the environment really would have stood out as unusual for someone planning a long summer hike in Zion. Early starts are just what people do out there, and heat management is usually baked into the timing of the day rather than something you avoid altogether. By the following day, official heat warnings had been issued across the park and surrounding canyon system. Forecasts projected temperatures rising above 100 degrees Fahrenheit at canyon level, with advisory guidance recommending that strenuous outdoor activity be avoided during peak daylight hours. The warning was distributed through multiple channels: visitor centers, shuttle stops, trailhead signage, and ranger briefings directed at incoming hikers. It was not framed as an abstract forecast, but as an active condition affecting decision-making on the ground. By that point, it was already influencing behavior, with some visitors shortening itineraries, adjusting start times, or turning back before committing to exposed or high-exertion routes. She acknowledged the advisory, but didn't really change her plan. Later that day, she drove north out of the canyon area toward higher elevation near the park boundary, and you could feel the difference pretty much right away with the change in altitude. It was cooler, less direct heat, just an entirely different feel compared to down in the canyon. Her movement through the area was brief but deliberate. She followed the access road leading toward the West Rim approach, stepped into the trail entry zone, and oriented herself visually along the route system that would eventually connect back into the canyon proper. The purpose of the visit was not exploratory in the traditional sense. She did not appear to be testing her capacity or reassessing difficulty. Instead, her actions suggested confirmation, verifying access points, understanding entry logistics, and visually reinforcing the path she intended to use. After a short period on foot near the trailhead area, she returned to her vehicle and drove back toward town. That evening, she spoke with someone close to her who raised explicit concerns about the forecasted heat and the physical demands of the route under those conditions. The conversation centered on timing and exposure, specifically the risks associated with sustained exertion in triple-digit temperatures and the difficulty of maintaining safe hydration levels over a long-distance canyon. Hike. In response, she described a plan built around a pre-dawn departure, intended to place her deep into the route before the sun fully reached the canyon floor.
Even hearing that conversation about the heat and the water, I feel like the plan was already locked in on timing more than anything else at that point.
She outlined steady forward movement through the hike, with an expectation of returning before peak temperatures fully developed in the late morning and afternoon. She also referenced carrying a limited supply of water and mentioned the possibility of a seasonal water source along the route, though there was no indication of a confirmed filtration method or a backup hydration strategy if that source proved unavailable. The assumption of availability remained unverified, but factored into her overall planning approach. Before ending the conversation, she agreed to send check-ins at key points along the hike, including major transitions along the route where her progress could be tracked. The agreement was framed as a simple precaution rather than a response to risk. After the call, she finalized her departure timing for the following morning, structuring it around a pre-dawn start intended to maximize travel through the canyon before environmental conditions reached their daily peak. She was moving before dawn. The Airbnb host later noted that her vehicle was already gone when he checked the driveway in the early morning hours, earlier than expected based on her stated plan to leave before sunrise. The drive from Springdale to the Lava Point trailhead takes roughly 40 to 50 minutes in light traffic, and she had driven the route before. She arrived at the Lava Point trailhead while it was still dark. Based on the timestamp of a photo she posted from the location, a headlamp-lit image of the trailhead sign framed by dense forest and a fully black sky. The caption read, "No permit needed for this entrance." At that elevation, temperatures were in the upper 50s and 60s Fahrenheit. She was dressed for cool pre-dawn conditions, wearing a long-sleeve base layer, with her hat stored in her pack. The environment was still and quiet, a brief desert interval before daytime heat began to build. She began the West Rim Trail shortly after arriving. The West Rim Trail from Lava Point to the canyon floor covers roughly 13 miles, with about 3,600 feet of net descent. The route alternates between gradual loss of elevation, flat stretches, and short climbs, before dropping more consistently toward the canyon. Under normal conditions, most hikers take around 5 to 8 hours to complete the one-way stretch, depending on pace and how much they're carrying, with the full out and back toward Angel's Landing adding up to roughly 16 to 17 miles. In mild weather, it's tough but doable as a full-day hike. In extreme heat, though, it stops feeling like a regular hike pretty quickly and turns into more of a long, drawn-out exposure situation out there on the trail. The upper section of the trail initially passes through dense forest, before opening into exposed ridgelines as elevation is lost. In the early portion of the hike, conditions were still shaded and cool, with minimal environmental stress beyond distance and navigation. She was moving through terrain that matched the expectations she had built during planning, and her pace remained steady through the first segment. At one point along the descent, she was encountered by two backpackers traveling in the opposite direction after completing their backcountry route. They later described her as moving steadily but at a slower pace than their own. In a brief exchange, she asked about conditions ahead, specifically crowding and water availability further down the trail. They reported that lower sections were becoming busier and that they had not stopped at the seasonal water source at Potato Hollow.
I look at this, and what really stands out to me is how much is being leaned on things that aren't really guaranteed, like assuming that water source will actually be there and actually usable without a real backup plan behind this whole thing.
They recalled her wearing a sun hat and a light long-sleeve layer, with a single water bottle visible on her pack. No additional hydration containers were observed. The interaction was brief, and both parties continued on their respective routes without further contact.
I think the whole check-in and timing thing just feels more like a plan on paper than something adjusting to what the trail was actually going to throw at her.
Based on this encounter and standard segment timing for the trail, she was estimated to be in the mid to lower portion of the West Rim corridor by that point, with several miles still remaining before reaching the junction with the Upper Angels Landing route above Scout Lookout. The remaining terrain from there transitions into progressively steeper descent, with increasing exposure and less shade as the trail approaches the canyon floor. By then, conditions below were already warming rapidly. As sunlight reached deeper into the canyon, temperatures were climbing into the upper 80s and continuing to rise steadily with full solar exposure. At that stage, she had been hiking for several hours and had covered roughly 8 to 9 miles, with the most technically exposed and physically demanding sections of the route still ahead. She posted from Scout Lookout late that morning. The photo showed her at the edge of the lookout platform, the canyon stretching behind and below her under a high, harsh sun. She was smiling. Her hat was on, and her pack sat high on her back, a standard day pack by appearance, with no visible hydration reservoir and nothing suggesting significant water capacity. The focus just kind of shifted away from the landscape itself and more toward the milestone she'd been building up to for months. The distance and conditions were still there, nothing about that changed, but they didn't really seem to land the same way at that moment. In that moment, the dominant perception was completion not of the route itself, but of the objective she had been working toward. The physical reality of the remaining distance, elevation loss, and rising heat remained unchanged, but it was no longer being weighted in decision-making. The Upper Angels Landing section from Scout Lookout to the summit spans roughly half a mile and gains about 430 feet in elevation. Unlike the approach from Lava Point, this is not a conventional hiking trail. The West Rim descent below it is still a maintained path, with defined tread and predictable footing, even if demanding in length and exposure. The chain section, by contrast, is a narrow ridge traverse with fixed chains anchored into sandstone, following an exposed spine with steep drop-offs on both sides. The rock itself is generally solid when dry, but the route requires constant attention and deliberate movement. Every step carries consequences that are not present on standard trail terrain. She moved through this section in the mid-morning window.
Honestly, Scout Lookout has always felt a bit deceptive to me, like people naturally read it as they made it, even though the hard part is still sitting right there in front of them on the return. And the chains section, I don't know, I always thought of it less like a hike at that point and more like something you have to fully respect every single step of, or it just doesn't work.
Her ascent was steady based on available timestamps from her posts. One image captured her partway along the ridge, looking back towards Scout Lookout and the canyon system she had come from. Another showed her at the summit, where the terrain opens into a wide, elevated panorama of southern Zion, with the Virgin River visible below and the canyon floor stretching outward through sandstone formations and tree-lined corridors. The summit post marked the completion of the climb and a brief pause at the top before she began her return. She remained at the top for a short period before beginning her return. During that time, she sent a voice message to a group chat, later described by recipients as sounding energized and slightly winded. She referenced the heat briefly but minimized it, describing conditions as manageable. Her focus was on reaching the summit and the sense of completion that came with it. She did not mention the total distance already covered, her remaining return route, or the state of her water supply. At that point, she was still several miles from the trailhead, with the only route back requiring retracing the exposed chain section she had just crossed, followed by a long descent through the canyon under rapidly intensifying heat. Temperatures at elevation are already in the upper 90s and continuing to rise through the late morning. She had covered roughly 9.5 miles from Lava Point, with sustained elevation change and prolonged exposure on open desert terrain. The descent toward the canyon floor had already removed most of her elevation buffer, leaving her roughly 5,800 feet above sea level, with a final return still requiring a steep climb out of the canyon system after completing the lower sections. Ahead remained the chain section, the switchbacks below Scout Lookout, and the long canyon approach to the trailhead a short distance on a map, but a significant physical effort after hours of continuous movement in rising heat. Under normal conditions, this return is hard but still doable. Here, though, it really wasn't in that normal space anymore. She was already tired, low on water, and moving straight into peak heat where everything just kind of piles on at once: fatigue, dehydration, and heat all feeding into each other. Heat exhaustion at this stage was no longer a discrete event, but the continuation of an accumulating physiological decline, where fatigue, dehydration, and heat exposure reinforced each other and progressively degraded coordination and judgment. There are no definitive witness accounts of her condition during the descent through the chain section. Two hikers moving in the opposite direction later described her as steady and unremarkable, consistent with many solo hikers navigating the same terrain. She was not observed requesting assistance or showing overt distress. She passed below Scout Lookout. Whether she paused there is unknown, and no reliable accounts place her resting despite the high foot traffic. From there, she continued onto the switchback descent toward the canyon floor, still within terrain that required attention, but now under increasing heat stress and accumulated fatigue.
One thing that sticks with me is how the summit can mess with your sense of where you're on the hike, because it feels like the goal is done, it's over with. But the reality is, you still have a long, exposed walk back in worsening heat.
The trail below Scout Lookout descends through a series of switchbacks carved into the canyon wall before eventually meeting the main canyon trail that leads toward the grotto trailhead. The terrain here is less exposed than the chain section above, but it is not straightforward. The grade remains steep, the footing shifts between packed sand and loose gravel, and the rock walls on both sides hold and re-radiate heat long after direct sun exposure, turning the corridor into a sustained warm zone with limited relief. Shade is minimal, and by late morning canyon, temperatures in this section typically reach the upper 90s and can approach triple digits. Roughly a third of a mile below Scout Lookout, the main trail curves around a rock outcrop. Right there, there's also this worn-down side path basically formed just from people repeatedly walking it over time that splits off from the main trail and leads back to a small overhang tucked just off to the side. The overhang casts intermittent shade on the rock beneath it, creating a visible contrast against the surrounding sunlit sandstone. To a passing hiker, it can resemble a natural pause point, a place to step off briefly, catch breath, or escape direct heat. Whether Vienne Jemison intentionally moved toward that shaded area in search of rest, or whether her navigation had degraded enough under fatigue and heat stress that she followed the worn path without clear intent, is not established. Both interpretations remain consistent with the physical evidence recovered at the scene and the medical findings regarding her condition at the time of the incident. What is established is that she left the main trail at that point and moved onto terrain that was no longer part of any maintained route. The ground transitions quickly from compacted sand to uneven sandstone slabs with a noticeable slope and intermittent drop-offs. These surfaces are not inherently unstable, but they demand precision in foot placement and full attention to balance. Under normal conditions, they require care. Under conditions of fatigue, dehydration, and heat stress, they leave very little room for error. The fall was not witnessed. Her final footprints indicate movement off the main trail and onto the unmaintained section before disappearing near the edge of the ledge system. Below that point, the terrain drops away steeply, with an approximate descent of 180 feet to the next stable shelf of rock. Later that day, her friends in a group chat attempted to reach her after the expected return window passed. Messages went unanswered, followed by repeated calls that went to voicemail. Concern escalated into a formal report when it became clear she had not returned to her lodging and had not exited the trail system.
It always looks easier than it is, but you're still dropping steep switchbacks with heat just sitting in the canyon walls the whole way down. That side path just feels like a quick spot people drift into to get out of the sun for a second.
Her rental vehicle was located at the Lava Point trailhead, establishing her point of entry on the West Rim approach. Combined with the earlier summit post and the absence of any return through the main canyon exit, this allowed rangers to narrow the search corridor to the stretch between Scout Lookout and the canyon floor. Search teams began ground operations from the upper trail. Her body was located later from the main route below the social trail divergence point. Recovery required rope-assisted access due to the steepness of the terrain. She was pronounced deceased at the scene, and recovery continued into the following hours under standard technical rescue procedures. The medical examiner conducted an autopsy 2 days after recovery. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from height, with a contributing factor of heat exhaustion. Findings indicated significant dehydration and prolonged heat stress at the time of death, reflecting a body already under sustained thermal strain that impaired coordination, judgment, and recovery capacity. No underlying cardiac or neurological condition was identified that would account for a sudden collapse independent of environmental exposure. A subsequent incident report by park authorities identified multiple contributing factors, including sustained extreme heat during the hiking period, insufficient hydration for the duration and distance of the route, and an access approach that extended both mileage and exposure compared to the standard route. It noted that bypassing the usual entry system formed part of a sequence of decisions that increased overall exposure and risk, though it was not identified as the direct cause of death. The combination of heat, distance, and fatigue was cited as the primary compounding factor. At her lodging, belongings were found undisturbed and partially packed, consistent with an expected departure. Travel arrangements for the following day remained unchanged. On her device, an unsent draft was recovered, referencing months of preparation and repeated attempts to secure access, ending with a reflection on finding a way forward despite those setbacks.